this is a case where we have to act. And Saudi Arabia human rights bilan is not very much good. So we should blame Saudi Arabia as much as we blame Iran or North Korea for the same reasons in terms of freedom of expression.
So there's a Saudi blogger named Raif Badawi who had the temerity to blog about freedom. In fact, his blog was called Saudi Liberal. So, of course, he was charged and convicted in a Sharia court in Saudi Arabia and sentenced to hundreds of lashings. Now, of course, you lash a man with a whip hundreds of times, you will kill him. So the merciful bigots at Saudi Arabia will only lash him 50 times in a row, let him heal and get his strength back. Then they'll whip him again, let him heal and get his strength back. It's basically torture, and this is not a rogue act. This is being done in the name of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They are fascists. They believe in torture. Really, they're not too different from the Islamic State. In fact, they regard themselves as an Islamic State. But they went one step further. Look, Saudi Arabia is a hellhole, and I pity anyone who has to live there like Raif Badawi. But Saudi Arabia's hand stretched into Canada this month when it sent this 2-page letter to the Speaker of the Quebec National Assembly. That's what they call their legislature in Quebec. And let me read a little bit from this letter. It starts off, Saudi Arabia expresses its strong surprise and dismay at what is being said in some of the media on the issue of Raif Badawi. So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia sends its ambassador to Canada to criticize, to condemn, to interfere, to meddle with our media, to criticize our freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and to do so by what? By tattling to our Speaker of the Legislature and condemning them too, because they've spoken out in defense of Raif Badawi. That is an atrocious interference. It's one thing for them to run their own country like a fascist state, but for them to write to our politicians to condemn our media, that's an outrage. That's a diplomatic incident is what that is. But the letter goes on. Let me quote it to you. Saudi Arabia, quote, does not accept any form of interference in its internal affairs. Did you get that? So when someone in the Quebec legislature criticizes Saudi Arabia, when a Canadian journalist criticizes Saudi Arabia, that apparently is interfering in their affairs. What we do here in Canada, when we exercise our journalistic freedoms, our freedom of the press, our democratic freedoms, when we speak out in our parliament, Saudi Arabia has the temerity to call that interference in their affairs, and yet they actually send a letter condemning our journalistic and political freedoms as if that's not interference. Let me just read one more line from this letter to show you not just the place they're coming from, but the century they're coming from, the medieval times. Let me quote this amazing sentence. Saudi Arabia was one of the first countries that supported human rights and respected all international conventions in accordance with the Islamic Sharia. Now I get it. See, when you and I talk about freedom and rule of law and things like that, we think of the Magna Carta, the Charter of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, maybe even the separation of mosque and state, the equality of men and women. In Saudi Arabia, none of those things have any meaning. They only believe in the Quran. They only believe in Sharia law. So human rights to them only means obeying Islam. They want us to follow that law too. They're a bunch of thugs, not just to Raif Badawi, who they're lashing physically, but to our journalists and politicians, who they're at least lashing diplomatically, more if they could. But there is an extra layer of chutzpah here. They're calling our mere peaceful discussion of their fascism interference. Yet every year, Saudi Arabia pumps millions of dollars into mosques around the world, including here in Canada, for those mosques to propagate the Saudi strain of Islam called Wahhabism. It's a fundamentalist, radical approach to Islam favored by the late Osama bin Laden, the terrorist leader of Al-Qaeda. Wahhabi Islam is a fascist form of Islam incompatible with Canadian values. Saudi Arabia pumps money into Canadian mosques to ensure that they follow that Wahhabi strain of Islam. That is real interference, political interference, financial interference, and it may even lead to the radicalization of Canadians who are going to fight with terrorist groups. That's real interference. And yet this Saudi thug sends a letter saying, how dare you criticize us? You know, I've had a run-in with the Saudi thugs before, and I'm using the word thug because that's what you call a country that officially lashes a man hundreds of times for having a different opinion. But they're trying to meddle with us too. Hey, 4 or 5 years ago, I produced a little video for my favorite group called Ethical Oil, comparing how we make oil here in Canada to how they do it in Saudi Arabia. Take a look at that video. Take a look.
Fact. Last year we bought over 400 million barrels of oil from Saudi Arabia. We bankrolled a state that doesn't allow women to drive, doesn't allow them to leave their homes or work without their male guardian's permission, and a state where a woman's testimony only counts for a half of a man's. Why are we paying their bills and funding their oppression? Today there's a better way. Ethical oil from Canada's oil sands. Ethical oil, a choice we have to make.
It's a little video. It's on YouTube. We managed to air it a few times on the Oprah Winfrey Channel and on the Sun News Network. But Saudi Arabia literally freaked out. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia hired Rahul Agarwal, a lawyer at Norton Rose, one of the largest law firms in the world with more than 2,000 lawyers. And Rahul Agarwal was instructed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself to threaten to sue me. Take a look. Here is an email from Rahul Agarwal on behalf of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia asking my lawyer where they can sue me. That's what service of legal documents means. Now, when I got this email, I made a big fuss about it, and the Saudis cowered back into their little rat hole, but not before trying to intimidate me. Well, they weren't satisfied with trying to threaten to sue me. The Saudi ambassador of the day actually demanded a meeting with John Baird, the foreign minister, about me and ethical oil. Here's an access to information document showing a briefing note prepared for John Baird at the time, showing that the Saudi ambassador was furious that I be allowed to make a video criticizing the way Saudi Arabia treats women. To his credit, John Baird didn't do a thing other than, I suppose, give a handshake to this little thug. But imagine what Saudi Arabia is doing on a daily basis here in Canada that we don't even know about. We barely know the thuggery they do in their own country, but you can see how they're trying to influence our culture here in Canada. Saudi Arabia is a disgraceful country. They are a fascist country. They are not our allies. And I put it to you that interfering in our affairs makes us them pretty close to our enemies. For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.